Okay, on my computer it says we're at the top of the hour. So I want to say welcome to everyone in this midwinter webinar to talk about accessing USDA programs, specifically through the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which helps farmers do conservation practices on the ground, as well as through the Farm Service Agency, but we will be focusing mostly on Farm Service Agency loans. They do have other programs which we will talk just slightly about. So we have two speakers, or maybe three. I'm going to start out with a few things, and then Kelsey Larson from Montana State University Extension will talk about the NRCS and helping you access those programs. And Teresa Engel, a Farm Service Agency loan officer, who works with many organic producers in Wisconsin. Next slide. So the agenda is who is OFA, if you've never heard of the Organic Farmers Association, overview of NRCS and FSA programs. There'll be some resources in the chat from the Organic Farmers Association, and then we'll have Kelsey's presentation and Teresa's presentation, and then we'll have some time for discussion. So if you put your questions in the chat, we will be monitoring those and be able to bring them forward. I want to say too that this is paid for by the uh, Transition to Organic program, and this is part of the Seeds of Success Farmer Networking Series, which is put on with the Organic Farming Research Foundation, National Organic Coalition, and OFA. Now the next slide. So who is OFA? Next slide. We are farmers. We do a policy survey every year where we promote policies at the state and federal level based on what organic farmers need in the United States. Next slide. We also have many work groups where that feeds into our policies. But not only that, we have found that when we especially have issues like our crop insurance work group has been able to work with RMA and have them tweak some of the procedures in their programs to make them more welcoming and helpful to organic farmers. So, and all of those needs were put forward by farmers for farmers. And there's a QR code there, or you can go on the Organic Farmers Association.org website and find out more and sign up. And there's no cost, of course. Next slide. So I just want to go over, my colleague Julia is going to put a couple of things in the chat, some links to our website about how NRCS can help you. And there's a lot of things if you're a transitioning farmer, if you just, are finding that your pastures are not as productive, you want to bring in more beneficial insects, even energy efficiency, and of course, soil and water quality are all covered under NRCS. Next slide. So there's a lot of things in organic management that NRCS can help cost share for you. If you need to have a buffer zone between your organic land and your neighbor's non-organic, there's windbreaks and prairie strips and things like that. So those areas would be still somewhat productive and helpful to you in an ecosystem way, even though you can't really sell any organic crops from that area. There's a lot of things for livestock. The NRCS specifically has it that 60% of all of their funding must go to serving livestock farmers. So if you're a livestock farmer, there's a lot the NRCS can do for you. But also for crops and for specialty crops, there's high tunnels and orchard management, and of course, waterways and fixing field roads and putting in stream crossings and helping with cover cropping and all those good things. Next slide. The FSA also has many things. A lot of people know FSA mostly through their farm loan program, but when there's a disaster, they can help with that. They help with if you need to improve your farm for food safety under the Food Safety Modernization Act. They have funding for that. They kind of help with crop insurance. And with the NRCS, you have to pay ahead for the practice that you're doing, and then the NRCS will reimburse you. If you don't have enough money, the FSA has a program there to kind of loan you the money until you get your practice installed, and then you can pay them when you're done and the NRCS approves that the contract was fulfilled as written. There's loan guarantees. There's mediation if you're having trouble with other USDA programs. And of course, there's organic certification cost share is run through either your state Department of Ag or through your local county farm service agency. And that's where you can get money back on your organic certification costs. Next slide. In the chat, there is a link to a pre-office checklist, and this was put together so that you as a producer can walk into the NRCS office and you've kind of done some of the work for them. You have identified the natural resource concerns that you have found on your farm, and we recommend that you also bring them a map to show them where those resource concerns are. So when they do make that trip to your farm, they have a better overall picture of what they're looking at. Next slide. The same thing on the FSA fact sheet is the things to like walk into the office prepared so you don't have to make a subsequent visit. You know, you might have to, but maybe instead of 3 visits, you'd only have to make 2. So we try to both make it easier for the very overworked staff at this point so you are more prepared when you walk in to the office and can move things along more quickly. Next slide. And now I am ready to turn it over to Dr. Kelsey Larson. I'm going to let Kelsey just introduce herself, and we're going to start the portion about NRCS and accessing their programs in 2026. Kelsey, are you?
Hello. Yep, I'm on here. Harriet, thank you very much for that overview of some of these programs. Those are some great resources, it sounds like, that you dropped in the chat for everyone here. So today I'm here to talk about organic and NRCS in 2026, helping you all understand some of the policy changes that have happened in this past year. So I'm an agricultural economist with MSU's Extension Service, and a lot of the research I do is on trying to understand what impact these different policies have, how we can design them better to work better for both farmers and for the environmental concerns they're designed to address. So I've been closely following the policy changes that have happened in this space over the last year, and I'm going to spend the time I have here today to get you all caught up on these changes as well. Next slide. So basically in this talk, I'm going to give you a big picture overview of the NRCS and organic funding. First, we're going to walk through what national policy actually changed in the last year. Second, we're going to discuss how this will affect your experience with the NRCS and other USDA programs. And finally, we'll look ahead a bit to what we might expect in 2026. Next slide. Okay, so we'll open up with that policy timeline, as I said. Next. So first, let's discuss, there were a few major steps in the policy timeline that happened over this past year. So in January through April, we had a series of executive orders that froze or changed spending in a range of different ways. In July, the Budget Reconciliation Bill, also known as the One Big Beautiful Bill or OB3, passed a number of revisions to agricultural policy. The continuing resolution in November that reopened the government after the shutdown included some clauses around agricultural funding. And finally, the Regenerative Agricultural Pilot Program was announced in December of this year. Next. So first, the executive orders. These started out on January 20th and continued through the next few months. In particular, the January 20th executive order froze any funding that came from the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act for review. Um, Mainly, they were intended to be reviewed for diversity, equity, and inclusion clauses and any focus on climate change. What this effectively meant was that significant shares of USDA programs, especially NRCS programs in the organic space, in EQIP and CSP, were temporarily frozen. So most contracts that were already signed and currently being executed were either unfrozen by the administration or by the courts sometime in the March-April timeline. However, some unsigned contracts were either canceled or altered, and some full entire programs after this review were either permanently closed or altered. Next. So then the executive orders essentially made a few changes to these programs on an ongoing basis. One of them is that they no longer have any priority system of benefits except for beginning farmers or veterans. In addition, carbon storage is removed from policy goals. So saying you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you're storing or sequestering carbon are no longer generally considered things that the USDA will reward in its contracts. So where green energy is still supported, and there are still ways you can get support for solar panels, etc., tends to be more limited, and you have to connect it to the outcomes of energy independence rather than necessarily climate goals. So in July, the OB3 first off rescinded the IRA's sort of short-term funding that it had allocated over several years for these conservation programs. But for many of the key USDA programs, it replaced those with permanent funding. So it kind of took the temporary funding from the previous administration and made it a permanent part of the funding package. In addition, it removed income limits and payment caps for many USDA programs, making them accessible to larger producers and wealthier producers. It also increased the generosity of many of the farm insurance programs, especially those aimed at commodity producers. And in general, has this focus on direct payments to producers and funneling these different USDA programs through that, as opposed to more structural concerns. Next. So on November 12th, after the government shutdown, the continuing resolution that reopened to the government had a few ag-related clauses. First of all, it extended the Farm Bill through 2026. And in doing so, it sustained funding at the same levels for most programs, although it did reduce budgets for some technical assistance programs. So again, this is part of the trend where programs that give direct payments to farmers, cut direct checks to farmers, tended to make it through with similar or higher funding levels. Programs that offer indirect support, funding expertise, technical assistance, employees, etc., tended to have a rougher time this past year. Next. All right, so now we'll talk through a few of these programs individually and what that means for you. So first of all, we think about the particularly key NRCS programs, the Conservation Cost Share programs. Mainly, this means EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, and CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program. EQIP tends to help you introduce a few more new practices. CSP helps you grow on past environmental improvements that you've already made. So after the initial freeze this year, these conservation programs were unfrozen. Contracts were honored for that. And again, what we saw instead was a re-entrenchment on increasing the levels of these programs or fixing them at fairly high programs. So OB3 made these higher funding levels for these programs coming from the Inflation Reduction Act permanent. As mentioned, it removed the cap on maximum EQIP contract size, which makes this more accessible to higher income and larger scale farmers. And again, it also removed the income eligibility limit for farmers who make more than 75% of their income through farming. However, it did reduce the funding for conservation technical assistance. Next. So one addition onto these programs is the Regenerative Pilot Program. This was announced in December, and they accepted the initial batch of applications on January 15th. We're still to see whether they'll continue to accept further applications through this program, but it seems quite likely. So in this regenerative pilot program, they committed $700 million to funding regenerative practices through EQIP and CSP. So there's a couple of changes to this as opposed to a normal EQIP or CSP application. One is that it allows you to condense applying for both EQIP and CSP into a single joint application. So you get to just send one in instead of two separate ones. There are also a few additional requirements that this program has. The first is that you need to have a whole farm assessment in order to participate. And second, that you need to implement one or more off a list of regenerative practices. I've listed some of the most common ones here. If you want further details, you can follow up on the NRCS's website, but it includes cover cropping, conservation crop rotations, contour farming, water management, mulching, nutrient management, pest management, grazing management, reduced or no-till, and strip cropping. This list includes many practices that organic producers either widely use or at least sometimes use. So it's quite possible that if you're interested in this program, there could be one or more practices that fit more well with the needs of your operation. The final additional requirement on this program is that they require both baseline and endline soil quality monitoring. Next. So overall, the picture here is that funding is still here for these key NRCS programs. The funding may shift a little bit in terms of what it's going to, shifting away from some of the climate smart agriculture practices, shifting towards some of these regenerative practices. In addition, these programs are now available for large operations making large investments. However, one thing that translates into is that applications may be more competitive. In the sense that now that these programs have been opened up to particularly large farmers who may be sending in particularly large applications, there may be more large contracts competing for the same pot of money. That said, we don't know exactly how many of these larger applicants are going to be entering into competition for these grants. So it's possible that that might not have much of an impact, but it could be a competitive cycle for this. Next slide. And again, when you're thinking about the application process, this is going to interact with the decreases in staffing that have happened over the last year. So one of the biggest changes came from the Deferred Resignation Program, the DRP, which allowed USDA employees to resign from their jobs with some severance pay. And the share of USDA employees lost is quite large. Depending on the state, they've lost 8 to 32% of the USDA employees through the DRP. Darker states here, the darker green, represent states that lost more employees through this. So there have been increased reports of slow USDA responses. But again, this is going to vary a lot depending on how many USDA employees in your area took up on these programs. So if you're applying this year, I'd encourage you to reach out to staff early, use some of the tools that the Organic Farmers Association shared to help streamline the process, and try to schedule appointments ahead rather than attempting to drop into these offices. So in line with that, how competitive are these grants? So in the past year, in 2024, with the increased funding from the IRA, we were seeing that a little bit more than 50% of CSP applications were accepted, a little more than 40% of EQIP applications were accepted. So again, with these different pressures, we might expect these programs to be at fairly similar acceptance rates in the next year, or possibly slightly decreased acceptance rates, depending on how many of those large farmers are entering the application pool. So it's good to work with your local USDA employees to make sure that you're putting in the best, most competitive application that you can. So overall, organic programs generally continue on track. Um, so the transition to organic partnership program um, reopened payments in February to May. However, the initiative is planned to end in 2026. The organic market developing grants, that said, with the top program, I believe there's a possibility that it'll get extended beyond then. Hard to predict. So organic market development grants have reopened as usual. Similarly with the Organic Agricultural Research and Extension Initiative and the National Organic Certification Cost Share Program has been funded through 2031. So that one we can expect to be sticking around for a while. So overall, organic programs have made it through pretty well and are continued to be funded into 2026. The biggest changes are to programs that are tied to climate goals, such as the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, which has typically offered grants to develop markets for low greenhouse gas emission agricultural products, and also offers producers cost share payments. So after this year, it's been renamed the Advancing Markets for Producers program. And basically, rather than allowing a mixture of producer payments and activities to help build these brands and pipelines, they now require that anyone applying for this program meets a very high threshold of paying most of the money here directly through producer cost share payments. The Regional Energy for America program, or REAP, has also been impacted in that they offer grants for energy efficiency improvements and renewable energy. So now it's still quite possible to get the energy efficiency grants, but there are restrictions on the use of this for solar and wind of how much you're allowed to construct. And they also removed priority for disadvantaged communities. Next. In another dimension, most of the government insurance programs are now more generous. So they increased the maximum coverage on the Whole Farm Revenue Program, or WFRP. So these programs are going to be a bit more generous. They've also extended beginning farmer subsidies out to 10 years. So if you started farming in the last decade, you're going to get slightly better, lower premiums on government insurance programs. For commodity producers, they raised some of the reference prices there. And again, they removed income and revenue caps on these subsidized payments. They're also offering a supplemental disaster relief program, giving extra payments to producers with natural disaster losses in 2023 or 2024. All right, so those are the changes we've seen in 2025. So I'll take a few liberties here and talk about what we might be expecting out of 2026. So one of the big questions in ag the last couple of years has been, when are we going to get a farm bill? So these days, the question isn't when we'll get a farm bill, but it is also if we'll get a farm bill. These days, in a recent poll, about 60% of agricultural economists think we might get a farm bill within the next year and a half. About 40% think we might not get a farm bill at all. It's possible that the way we do farm policy has shifted from the farm bill every 5 years to we might see more years that look like 2026, where we have multiple different legislative steps that are impacting different programs, deciding funding for different programs, rather than one big cohesive package. So that's something to keep an eye on for the future. So after this year, we can say it's highly likely that EQIP and CSP will continue to be funded at high levels. Remember, what we saw was the previous Democratic administration dramatically increased the level of funding for these programs. And the Trump administration then stepped in and made those higher levels permanent. So we're seeing a clear bipartisan commitment to keeping these programs substantially funded. And certainly within this administration, we can expect funding is going to focus on direct producer payments over other kinds of support. Um, and we're currently seeing, as far as priorities go within these programs, a shift on emphasis towards regenerative agriculture, which has some potential to be beneficial for organic farmers who are able to connect the work that they're doing on their organic farms to some of these regenerative priorities. There's heavy overlap between the two lists. Well, thanks so much. And I will take questions after Teresa's presentation and our Q&A. And also, please feel free to reach out to me individually if you have any other questions that I can help with.
Thank you so much, Dr. Larson. Your timing was great. And I want to say too, someone asked a question about organic certification cost share, and I put an answer in the chat. So let's move next to Teresa. Kelsey, you might want to look at the chat. There were a few questions about NRCS programs, so you can be prepared to answer them later. So let's get started with Teresa, who will talk about FSA loans.
All right, thanks, Harriet. And thanks for the opportunity to talk about FSA farm loans. So I'm a farm loan manager of 12 counties in western Wisconsin. We do have a very diverse portfolio. We've got 5 loan officers that have a lot of organic producers in our portfolio, a lot of specialty crops. We've got grain, livestock. We're diverse. And personally, I come from a farm, from a family farm in Minnesota, and my husband currently farms about 100 acres of organic vegetables in western Wisconsin. All right, next slide. So as Harriet mentioned, FSA does a ton of things. I focus entirely on farm loans. I've never worked in any other department, so I'm not going to talk at all about any of the other things. We're going to hone in 100% on farm loans. Next slide. We do have a broad footprint. There's over 2,100 offices nationwide. And here in Wisconsin, pretty much every county has an office, but not quite. And while every office is going to offer farm loans, there might not be a loan officer in every office. So a lot of my loan officers cover 4 counties. You can always call the local office and they'll get you connected to who the proper loan officer is for that county. I stress really hard to call for an appointment. As has been alluded, we are down on staff numbers. So that's the best thing to do is call for an appointment. Next slide. So there's lots of different types of farm loans. I'm going to go into detail on farm ownership loans and operating loans, and when they are direct loans. So that means that you as a borrower have a relationship and a loan directly with FSA. We do guarantees as well, but that's when you have a relationship with a lender, and then the lender applies to us, and our relationship is between us and the lender, and we provide a guarantee. So I'm not going to talk about those today. We also have microloans, and basically that's any loan that's under $50,000. It's a streamlined process, a little quicker. And we do have youth loans for kids up to the age of 21, and farm storage facility loans for storing commodities, and or you can use it for some equipment and handling products, like in a pack shed of a veggie production facility. So real quick overview on eligibility. You must be the owner operator of the farm. So we can't do a farm purchase if you plan on renting it out. You've got to be the actual operator of the farm. And we want to make sure that it's not, just a rural resident. So our rule of thumb is that the gross farm income should at least cover the principal and interest debt payments on the farm. So, if you've got $20,000 mortgage, you should be at least producing gross farm income of $20,000, not net, but gross. Satisfactory in credit. We're going to look at credit just like a bank would. We don't necessarily use a score and have a benchmark on the score, but we're going to look at a pattern of repayment. Are there issues? Are there not? Operating loans, we need at least 1 year of some kind of experience, whether it's through education, training, or on-farm experience. For farm ownership loans, we need 3 years worth of experience. Ideally, that's 3 years of actual farming. Maybe it's on a leased property or you're farming with parents. You can substitute some of those years. So if you've got 16 years of college or 16 credits of ag classes from college, or you've owned your own business, there's a variety of things that you can substitute to meet that criteria. And then the last one, oops, I gotta get the chat out there. Okay. Being unable to obtain credit elsewhere. So we cannot compete with banks. If you can easily access credit from a bank, you do got to go that route. We are here sort of as a safety net for those that can't access credit. And oftentimes that's beginning farmers that don't have down payment. They're entering into a market that banks maybe are not comfortable with or familiar with, or the cash flow is too tight. And then finally, we want to make sure that the operation is going to cash flow. Next slide. So operating loans, the maximum amount that we can loan is $400,000. They're in 2 different categories, term loans and annual. So a term loan is for things like equipment or livestock, anything that's going to be amortized a little bit longer because your collateral is a little bit longer. Usually they're 7 years. Our current interest rate is 4.625 fixed. And then annual loans are 1-year loans generally. It's for input costs, for feed, fertilizer, stuff that's coming in and going out in 1 year. They're almost always paid back within 1 year. Sometimes they could be paid back within 24 months, but that's if you're going to store crops and not sell them for within the first year. Next slide. So this is just a quick example of a operating loan. So this is an example of a term. Let's say you're going to purchase 50 dairy cows for $100,000. And if it was set up at a 7-year note with a 7-year AM at the current interest rate, that annual payment is about $17,048. So this generally would be paid back with a dairy assignment. So that's $710 per milk check. Our security would be the cows that we purchased. And if there's existing cows out there, we would take a lien on all of those cows, but we do need to be in first position. If there's not enough security there, FSA is trying to get a security margin of 1.25. We may take a lien on real estate, but that's not common. So remember this annual installment of $17,048 on this example. Then we'll move on to the next slide. So let's say that you're a transitioning farmer and you have 3 years where cash flow is going to be a lot tighter than what it's going to be once you're organic. We do have some options, especially on the term loans, to make this payment restructure a little bit better. I know that this slide is so small and I'm sure you can't read this. So option 1, there's 5 different options laid out here. And option 1 really says if the $17,048, that's a payback of 7 years equally amortized. We can do interest only for 1 year. We can do interest only for 2 years. We can do interest only for 3 years. So there are other options there. Option 3 is interest only for 3 years. And then it's a really aggressive payback of $27,396 for the remaining 3 years if you really wanted to keep that as a 7-year term. The last option, option 5, is the 3 years of interest only payments. And then this is an amortization of 12. So your next 3 years are not as bad. It's $13,836. But then what happens is at year 7, we have to stretch out what's left. And we turn it into a new loan because a 7-year term is what our requirements are. So there are options for interest only, and in particular on term operating loans. Next slide. Farm ownership loans. So these are for when you are going to purchase a farm, or you're going to, maybe you already own a farm and you want to put up a barn or freestall or some sort of capital improvement. But these are long-term loans, 30 to 40-year loans. So it's for real estate purchases or improvements. $600,000 is our maximum. And there's really 3 options that are available. The first one is if you know for sure you can't work with a bank, you don't have a down payment, cash flow is tight, the bank's not interested, you can do 100% of the financing with FSA. And the interest rate on that right now is 5.625%. And that can be termed out for 40 years. Number 2 is called a participation loan. So if you've got a lender that is interested in participating, we can do 50% of the financing with FSA and then 50% of the financing with this other lender. This is a good option because your interest rate is lower from us. It's 3.625%. We can still term this one out for 40 years, but then the remaining 50% would be whatever that lender's rates and terms are. And then the third option, and this one's only available to beginning farmers, and USDA's definition is farming for 10 years or less to be a beginning farmer. This is called the 54550, which requires a 5% down payment from the farmer. 45% of the financing comes from FSA, and 50% of the financing comes from another lender. Now this one, the 45% from FSA is the lowest interest rate at 1.625 is what it is right now in January. This one we can only term out to 20 years. So you want to do the math on this and run a bunch of amortization schedules to see which one would cash flow the best for you, which one you're going to pay the least amount of interest in, but there's lots of options when it comes to a farm purchase. Next slide. Again, this is the 100% financing with FSA. It's a very popular one that we do. There's no down payment required. It can be termed up to 40 years. Our collateral will be a first mortgage on the property to be purchased. If you do own real estate already, we will try to get up to 1.25, just like I said with the operating loans. But we will not take a lien on farm personal property if all you're asking for is a farm real estate loan. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the 5 C's of credit and just give kind of a preview of what FSA looks at when we are making loan decisions. 5 C's credit is what a lot of commercial lenders use as well, but sometimes FSA is looking at things just slightly different. So next slide. First one is character. So this is really looking at the managerial experience. You know, do you have the knowledge? Do you have the acumen to do the things that you say you're going to do? You know, if you're going to do dairy, goats, do you have experience? Have you done a mentorship? Have you done market research? Have you submitted really detailed records, or are you making a lot of general assumptions? Have you worked with extension? These are the sorts of things that we're going to look at in great detail, especially if it's a brand new operation and there isn't historical records to back it up. Then we got to look at lots of detail and see that you as the applicant have done your research and done your homework to make a good business decision. Next slide. The other part of character that I mentioned earlier is credit history. We will look at repayment issues. If there are issues, you know, were they isolated or is it a pattern? If they're medically related and it was a one-time thing, we'll take that into consideration. Even if it dings your credit score down a whole lot, like I said before, we don't use scores as a yes or no. We look at patterns. We look at, you know, what is the overall view. We'll talk to other lenders. We'll verify debts with them and see if you've got good repayment history with other creditors. So we're trying to look at the broad picture of credit history there. Next slide. Capital. So all of our applications require a current balance sheet, and the balance sheet will tell us just how strong the capital is. Do you have sufficient working capital to do what you say you're going to do? So I guess a good example of this is if you're a crops farmer or veggie farmer and you've got a bunch of input costs, seeds, fertilizer, do you have cash in the bank? Or do you have a revolving line of credit with another lender? Or do you have access to liquidity? What sources do you have for working capital? Or do you have non-farm income that you're going to be putting into it? If you don't have those things, are you looking at asking for an annual operating loan with us? So that comes along to the character as well as are you being proactive to think about all the things that you might need to make this operation cash flow? Next slide. Capacity. Will it work? This is where our loan officers probably spend the majority of their time. The one thing, if you do have historical records, the loan officers are going to look at your Schedule F and your tax returns. And so if you've got 3 years, they'll spread those out and they're going to take a 3-year average. And if what you are projecting is right in line with that 3-year average, there's really no issues whatsoever at all. We get into a lot of analysis when there's changes to the operations and we need to justify those changes. So let's say the Schedule F hasn't looked very good and you're planning on making some changes. Well, we need to document what those changes are and that there is market research that can support what the changes you're suggesting are. If it's a brand new operation and there's no history to support the projection, this is where you're going to need to have a lot of market prices. You could possibly have contracts or some other substantial evidence to really back up what you're suggesting you're going to do. Next slide. So there's a lot of different documentation sources that you can research and you can provide. FSA does publish some planning prices. There's no organic prices on there, so that is not super useful for this audience. We do use USDA's organic report. Locally here, we'll use, what our local organic dairy provides. We've got organic egg contracts. So this is really industry specific and market specific, depending on what you're growing, depending on what you're raising. And there's a lot of flexibility here with your loan officer and conversations with your loan officer to show them what the capabilities are. You can use extension reports. You can use ATRA. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different resources out there to develop enterprise budgets. And this is where the bulk of the conversation with your loan officer most likely would be. Next slide. Collateral. So all loans must be secured by assets of having a security value of at least 100%. So if we're going to buy $100,000 worth of cows, they need to be valued at least $100,000. But if there is security that is in existence that you already own, FSA tries to get up to 125%. Security value should have the useful life that matches or exceeds the loan. So for example, when we were talking about that operating loan, we could term the cattle loan out for 12 years because, especially dairy cattle, because that's something that you're constantly replacing. Values for real estate are always determined by appraisals. And there's a couple examples of collateral. So on real estate, we're going to take a mortgage, and on operating loans, we would take security in livestock and equipment and maybe a mortgage. And the last C is conditions. So if we are getting close to the end and we know it's going to be approved, these are sort of the last things that need to happen. We approve our loans before we order the appraisal because that is something that FSA pays for. So once it's been approved, we'll do that. We'll also require that there's farm insurance on there and listing FSA as a mortgagee or loss payee. We may require crop insurance depending on what you're doing. We want to make sure that the water is clean, there's a working septic. We'll have our security filings. We'll do title insurance and closing costs. All of those things are included as loan conditions. Next slide. So approval and servicing. So if we meet all of the 5 C's of credit, the loan most likely would be approved. And that's not where the relationship ends. Farm lenders maintain a very long relationship with their clients. Any of these real estate loans are 30 to 40 years. And inevitably, there are some services that need to happen. Maybe they need a release or a subordination, or they're changing ownership structures, or they're starting to struggle and they need a restructure. So these are all things that we do. We work with farmers to the best of our ability to keep them on the land and keep their farms operating. We do this through yearly farm analysis. If we notice that there's some red flags that they should be thinking about, we'll certainly let them know. And then we connect them to other services. If they're in a situation where farming is not looking like it's a good path forward, here in Wisconsin, we've got the Farm Center, which is a part of the Department of Ag. And I'm certain most states have some sort of services that they can provide for farms that are in need of a transition or in crisis. So that, I think, is it from me. And I know we've got lots of time for questions.
Yes, thank you to both of you. There were some good questions in the chat. I think I'll start with the first one for you, Teresa, which is, do you see any opportunity for loan calculations to be based on organic prices going forward into the future? For example, when you get a storage loan.
Like a farm storage facility loan? Oh, well, I think we can use organic prices. We should be able to use organic prices now, in terms of developing the cash flow anyways. We certainly can do that on the direct side. We do dairy loans all the time and we use organic prices. So maybe I'm not fully understanding the question.
Great. And isn't there something like if you're a dairy farmer too, you can kind of postpone the equity payments. You can just only pay interest until you start after the first year when you've gone through your transition. Then you can start making the full payments when you actually are getting the organic price.
Yes. And so that's kind of that slide. That's the really tiny print when I was talking about the 3 years of interest only. That's exactly what that is.
Can I clarify, Harriet? My understanding, Teresa, is that some of the farmers that would like to use organic prices for the farm storage loans are being told that they can't do so and that it has to be based off of conventional prices. So I think the loan is capped much lower, and I don't know all of the details, but my understanding was that that was a barrier to those storage loans. Do you have any sense of that?
I don't, and I'll look into it. But yeah, that would be news to me.
And I can circle back with the farmers too, and with you also. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, my understanding is that the FSA loans have a lot of flexibility. And if you've got someone who understands both organic and the flexibilities, they can figure out the way to make it work. Okay, the next question will be for Kelsey. What metric is being used for soil quality monitoring under the regenerative pilot?
Great. And I was seeing a few questions in the chat about the regenerative pilot. So I will try to answer as many of those as I have answers to in one go here. So as far as the exact soil metrics that they're looking for, I'm honestly not sure yet. They haven't, as far as I can tell, it hasn't been clearly published anywhere publicly. And it's, from what I understand, that's going to be part of sort of the next step in the process, that once your application has maybe been accepted, but you haven't yet started doing the practices, that at that point they're going to have you do the soil test baselines. But again, that's one of those, we don't totally know what's going on in this space yet, categories, as far as I can tell. So another question that folks had was, what sort of plan do you need for this? What does a whole farm plan look like? So what they have told you is that it requires meeting the NRCS planning criteria for soil and water. So essentially the same as previously, if you were going to discuss soil quality or water quality as resource concerns in an NRCS application, your whole farm plan needs to meet the standards for those two categories. I think an OSP alone might not have the exact data in the exact format that they want, but probably starting with the data that's on your OSP is going to be a good start towards getting you to a successful application there. And these whole farm plans can be made by USDA staff, partners, or technical service providers. Yeah, and essentially what this program has done is they haven't added new money for this regenerative pilot. They have just required that 25% of EQIP and CSP funding this year be redirected towards this regenerative pilot program. Yeah, I think that's the main things I have to contribute there.
Well, there is a little bit of discussion about what is the definition of regenerative. Does the NRCS have any specific on that?
Let's see if I can find the language. But in general, I don't have a quote directly in front of me, but in general, they have a strong focus on that regenerative is sort of agricultural practices that prioritize soil health. So this is still being pinned down in some of its more exact formats. Right now, it seems to be practices that are working towards that goal of improved soil health. And one way that that's going to be defined and that these programs are going to be shaped going forward is that this December establishment of the pilot program also announced that there's now going to be an NRCS chief regenerative agriculture advising council. So this regenerative agricultural advising council members haven't been released yet, but it's going to be an advising council that meets quarterly that's going to help guide the NRCS's approach to promoting regenerative agriculture. So if you want to know where some of this regenerative agricultural policy is going to go in the NRCS, you'll probably want to keep a close eye on who ends up on that council, and then what sort of information and ideas are coming out of those folks.
Sounds a little bit like the cart before the horse, but oh well. And I guess the last question on that would be the deadline was January 15th to sign up. Have you had any feelers if they got enough applications and if they might do a spring ranking date where they then take a few more applications?
So I think this is partially going to depend on a state-by-state basis. The January 15th deadline was what the USDA calls a batching deadline, which basically means they're going to take a big chunk of applications that were submitted before this date, and they're going to process them and decide whether to fund them or not. So most USDA offices in the country will have several batching dates a year. Given that the USDA is required to spend 25% of their EQIP and CSP money on this program this year, I would assume that they're also going to be taking some of these regenerative contracts at some of their other batching dates. That's something that you can look up. Individual states get to decide the batching dates for the most part, aside from this January 15th batching date, which was set as a national requirement. Many states have a batching date that will be sometime in the late spring. They often will also have one that is sometime in the fall. So again, look up your local office, and the further out you can plan before one of those batching dates to try to get your application in, the better.
I guess I'll just explain the batching dates. Everything that has been submitted between the previous batching date and the current batching date are all the ones that they then look at and rank them against each other. Another thing that you could possibly do to improve your capability of getting funding is to try to do maybe a longer contract where maybe you might do three things, but do one the first year, another the second year, and then the third thing the third year. And then they assign the points by how many practices and what type of practices you're doing, and that might raise the points in your ranking or batching to that you would come to the top rather than going in 3 different years and applying for only one item. You might not have then as many points. So that's kind of a little inside thing. I have another
And one other tip along those lines is that the ranking algorithms for the USDA prioritize projects that solve clearly defined resource concerns. So if you can say, my problem is water quality, and I'm going to fix it this way, or I'm concerned about this aspect of erosion or soil quality, and I'm going to use this practice that directly fixes that problem. That's a lot of what the USDA is looking for. So the more that you can, in your farm plan and in the documentation you put in, clearly show this is the resource concern I have, this is the plan that is going to fix that problem. That's the linkage that they're really looking for.
Yeah, and so then our little pre-office checklist that helps you identify your resource concerns. One thing that I always laugh at, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, says resource concerns. But if you ask a farmer, what resources am I short of? They would mostly say money. So just it's not money, it's a natural resource concern you're trying to address. And then the NRCS will help you with that cost share. But I do have another question for Teresa, and that is, do those natural disaster loss payments include both crop losses and infrastructure? I know that's not a loan question, but maybe you have some idea.
Yeah, so I think that there's a number of disaster programs. Some of those are administered through the farm program side and not necessarily through farm loans. So I'm not sure that I know the exact answer to that one. If it was a disaster that we had a loan with already, we certainly have some tools that we can use. There's a disaster set aside where we can set aside a payment entirely for a year. We can do emergency loans when there's been a natural disaster, and that includes both production and facilities. But in terms of anything that's being administered from the farm program side, I can't speak to that with any level of expertise.
Okay. I think my understanding is it depends on the infrastructure that was destroyed by the disaster. I think they'll help like with fencing in livestock, but maybe they would not help with like replacing a whole building, for instance. So I don't know. You'd have to, talk. I think it's very dependent on that. Okay. And it's true, somebody put in there that at any time you can go in and apply for an NRCS program, but it's always nice to know when those batching dates are, because if you walk in the day after the batching date was, then you'd have to wait a lot longer than if you had started the process about 3 to 5 weeks before the batching date, then you would get in on that batch. Because sometimes the batching dates can be a whole year apart. So that would be a significant amount of waiting.
Yep, and sometimes an office will spontaneously add a batching date. For example, if they notice that there's a bunch of applications piling up when the next planned batching date isn't for a while, they'll decide, you know what, we've got enough, let's disperse some funding, and they might drop one in an unexpected time. But generally, yeah, you don't want to count on that happening, and trying to make it in by a batching date deadline will ensure you don't have to push a practice back to the next year.
There was a question about being on the advising council for regenerative agriculture. And I guess on the website, someone said that it still sounds like it's open, but I know through the National Sustainable Ag Coalition, they put forward a list of both organic and sustainable farmers to the NRCS, I think before Christmas. So I think that the nominating people to be on that council is closed, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I will say I never saw a open portal or anything for submissions there. And it's unclear to me how exactly they're processing the decisions of who joins it. So I'm afraid in this case, your guess is probably better than mine.
I know that a whole group of really good farmers was from around the country was put forward, and I know that it was a very short timeline that they had to get that in. So, but who knows where they're going to look for that. And also too, somebody asked if they're certified as regenerative and organic, and there is a regenerative organics third-party certification. Would that help towards the whole farm assessment? Because that obviously would cover a lot of regenerative practices.
Um, I don't believe that the USDA algorithms take those kind of certifications into account. But if you have already done the process and collected all the information that you have for that entire process, you probably have set yourself up pretty well for potentially looking at a CSP application that's going to reward some of the ongoing work that you're clearly doing for good resource management, while also helping you add some new things onto that. One thing about these USDA programs is that they are always trying to help you add on to what you're currently doing. They're always trying to help you solve one more problem. So whenever you're looking at these applications, generally, they're going to want you to add on at least something to your existing list of practices, even if you're already doing very, very well.
Right. And so two more quick questions. One for Kelsey. Do you know if nonprofits would be eligible for the regenerative pilot program, or do you need to be an individual farmer?
I think this would follow the same rules as EQIP and CSP, where in order to apply, you do need to have control of the land that you're farming. I think in some cases they will accept long-term leasing situations, but generally ownership. Um, so I believe if you're a nonprofit that owns the land that you're farming, possibly. Um, but I would want to check with your local NRCS employee for that one.
Okay, so now the last question's for Teresa. Can you talk a little about the process of applying for a farm loan? Is there pre-approval, and are there any specifics that would be helpful to know when drawing up a contract for a piece of land if I was to pursue an FSA loan? Does the processing for one of these whole farm ownership loans take a certain amount of time?
Yep, that's a really good question. First answer is we do not do pre-approvals. And the reason that we do that is because every farm is different in terms of the land makeup and the building infrastructure. And the farm projection that you are creating is often dependent upon what that farm looks like. So we don't do pre-approvals. What I always tell people when they're drawing up an offer to purchase is you should be expecting from the date that FSA has a complete application, meaning they have everything that they need. It can take the loan officer up to 30 days to make a decision. And then we order that appraisal. So that's another 30 days. And then we do title work and closing conditions, another 30 days. So you should be putting in your offer to purchase a financing contingency of probably 120 days. We need the offer to purchase as a part of our application. And let's see, what were some of the other pieces of that? Yeah, so 90 days for us. I'd say 120 days on the contract. Other stuff that you would want to put on the contract, that's something you could, if you want to seek legal counsel, you certainly could. Otherwise, there are some templates of offers to purchase that are available to download. We see these from super formal offer to purchases to very, very informal. What we need is a seller and buyer signature. We need a legal description so we know what property we're talking about, the acreage, and it needs to be dated, and that financing contingencies should really be in there.
Well, great. Well, we're not too far over, but this was really great. There was so much information. I really learned a lot, and I'm really glad that we had a good group here to hear all this. And especially, I guess the big takeaway would be there is still funding out there. That funding has not been cut. So feel free to walk into your USDA offices and talk to them about the many cost share dollars that they have out there to improve your farm, or buy a farm, or buy equipment, all the things that farmers need. So I guess with that, I'm going to say thank you for joining us and hope to see you again.